On the afternoon of November 17, 1984, Thomas Brennan sat in a conference room on the third floor of the Central Intelligence Agency headquarters in Langley, Virginia, reviewing field reports from Moscow Station that made no sense. He was 42 years old, a career counterintelligence officer who had spent the previous 16 years tracking Soviet intelligence operations against the United States, and what he was reading suggested that something fundamental had changed inside the KGB, something that nobody at the agency had anticipated or could adequately explain. The reports were routine surveillance summaries, the kind of operational traffic that moved through Langley every day, documenting the movements of known and suspected KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover at Soviet embassies throughout Western Europe and North America. But embedded within the routine details, there were anomalies, small discrepancies that individually meant nothing but collectively formed a pattern that troubled him deeply. Brennan had joined the CIA in 1968, recruited directly out of Georgetown University, where he had majored in Russian studies and spent 2 years in an intensive language program that left him fluent enough to read Soviet newspapers without a dictionary and conduct conversations with native speakers without pausing to translate in his head. His first posting had been to the Soviet division at headquarters, working as an analyst reviewing intelligence reports from human sources operating inside the USSR and satellite states. The work had been methodical, detail-oriented, the kind of assignment that required patience and an ability to identify patterns across hundreds of documents that seemed unrelated on the surface. He had been good at it, good enough that by 1973 he had been promoted to the counterintelligence section, where his responsibilities expanded to include identifying Soviet penetrations of Western intelligence services and tracking the operational methods the KGB used to recruit and run agents inside NATO countries. The conference room where he sat was unremarkable, a 12 by 15-foot space with a long rectangular table, 8 chairs, fluorescent lighting that hummed faintly, and walls painted institutional beige. There were no windows, no decorations, nothing to indicate the classified nature of the work conducted there, except for the combination lock on the door and the secure document safe in the corner. Brennan had spread 14 separate field reports across the table, each one stamped with classification markings in red ink, each one originating from a different CIA station in Europe or North America, each one documenting activities that, when viewed individually, appeared routine, but when examined collectively, suggested something was wrong inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus. The reports covered a 3-month period from August through October of 1984, and they all shared a common characteristic that had caught Brennan's attention during his morning review of the incoming cable traffic. Soviet intelligence officers who had been active and productive for years, officers who had been running established networks of agents and conducting sophisticated espionage operations, were suddenly behaving erratically, making operational mistakes that seasoned professionals should not make, and in several cases simply disappearing from surveillance coverage entirely without explanation or observable pattern. One report from the Paris station described a KGB officer named Viktor Leonov, who had been operating under diplomatic cover as a second secretary at the Soviet embassy since 1981. Leonov had been identified by French counterintelligence as a line KR officer responsible for penetrating and monitoring French intelligence services and political organizations. He had been careful, disciplined, following textbook tradecraft, maintaining a regular schedule of diplomatic functions and social engagements that provided cover for his intelligence activities. But in late September, according to the surveillance report, Leonov had begun showing up late to scheduled meetings, missing appointments entirely, and on at least 2 occasions had been observed drinking heavily at diplomatic receptions, behavior that was inconsistent with his previous operational discipline. The French had flagged it as potentially significant, possibly indicating that Leonov was under stress or facing pressure from his superiors in Moscow, and they had requested CIA assessment of whether this behavior suggested an opportunity for recruitment or a sign that the officer was preparing to defect. Another report from the London station documented similar anomalies involving Sergei Davidov, a GRU officer assigned to the Soviet military attaché office who had been running a technical intelligence network targeting British defense contractors. Davidov had been assessed by MI5 as highly competent, methodical, and professional. But in early October he had abruptly ceased all operational activity, stopped attending his regular social functions, and had not been observed outside the Soviet embassy compound for 2 weeks straight. British counterintelligence had noted the change but had not been able to determine the cause. The pattern repeated itself in reports from stations in Bonn, Brussels, Rome, and Ottawa. Soviet intelligence officers who had been active and productive were suddenly behaving in ways that suggested internal turmoil, operational dysfunction, or loss of command authority. Brennan had been reviewing these reports because they had all been flagged by the Operations Directorate as potentially indicating a coordinated Soviet intelligence operation, possibly a deception campaign designed to confuse Western counterintelligence services or test their surveillance capabilities. But the more Brennan read, the less convinced he became that this was a deliberate operation. The pattern was too widespread, too inconsistent, too messy to be controlled from Moscow center. It looked less like a coordinated deception and more like organizational breakdown, and that possibility was what troubled him most, because if the KGB was experiencing internal problems serious enough to affect field operations across multiple continents, it suggested something fundamental was happening inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus that the CIA did not understand and could not predict. He spent the rest of the afternoon cross-referencing the field reports with classified assessments of Soviet political and economic conditions compiled by the agency's Directorate of Intelligence. Those assessments painted a picture of a Soviet Union in the early stages of systemic crisis. Economic growth had stagnated, agricultural production was declining, consumer goods were scarce, and the military budget was consuming an increasingly unsustainable portion of the national economy. The reports noted that Soviet leadership under Konstantin Chernenko was weak and ineffective, that factional struggles within the Politburo were intensifying, and that there were signs of growing discontent among the Soviet population, particularly in the non-Russian republics where nationalist sentiment was beginning to surface in ways that challenged the ideological foundations of the Soviet state. But none of these assessments suggested that the KGB itself was experiencing operational difficulties, and none of them explained why Soviet intelligence officers across Western Europe and North America were suddenly behaving as if they had lost confidence in their mission or their organization. Brennan left the conference room at 6:15 in the evening and walked down the corridor to the office of Dennis Cartwright, the Deputy Chief of the Counterintelligence Staff. Cartwright was 58 years old, a career intelligence officer who had joined the agency in 1952 and had survived the institutional paranoia of the Angleton years when suspicion of Soviet penetration had paralyzed operations and destroyed careers. He had a reputation for skepticism, for demanding evidence before accepting conclusions, and for understanding that intelligence work required patience and tolerance for ambiguity. Brennan knocked on the doorframe and Cartwright looked up from the document he was reading and waved him in. Brennan explained what he had found in the field reports, laying out the pattern of erratic behavior among Soviet intelligence officers and suggesting that it might indicate internal problems within the KGB rather than a coordinated deception operation. Cartwright listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, and when Brennan finished, Cartwright asked whether there was any hard evidence to support the assessment beyond behavioral observations compiled by foreign liaison services. Brennan admitted there was not, that the evidence was circumstantial and based on pattern analysis rather than concrete intelligence from sources inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus. Cartwright nodded slowly and said that without corroborating intelligence from human sources or signals intercepts, it would be difficult to convince the Operations Directorate to shift resources toward investigating internal KGB problems when the more immediate concern was identifying and neutralizing Soviet penetrations of Western intelligence services. But Cartwright also said that Brennan's analysis was worth pursuing, that the pattern was unusual enough to warrant further investigation, and that if the KGB was experiencing internal dysfunction, it represented a potential opportunity for the agency to exploit. He told Brennan to compile a comprehensive assessment of the anomalies, to include all available reporting from foreign liaison services and CIA stations, and to prepare a briefing for the Deputy Director for Operations within 2 weeks. Brennan returned to his office and began the systematic process of gathering and analyzing every piece of available intelligence related to Soviet intelligence operations over the previous 6 months, looking for patterns that might confirm or refute his initial assessment. What Brennan did not know, what nobody at the CIA knew in November of 1984, was that his analysis was correct and that the behavioral anomalies he had identified were symptoms of a crisis inside the KGB that would eventually contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The crisis had begun in the summer of 1984 when a mid-level KGB officer named Konstantin Volkov, stationed at the first Chief Directorate headquarters at Yasenevo on the outskirts of Moscow, had begun noticing discrepancies in the internal financial records of his department. Volkov was 39 years old, a career intelligence officer who had joined the KGB in 1968 after graduating from the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He had spent the first decade of his career working in the Second Chief Directorate, handling counterintelligence operations inside the Soviet Union, before transferring to the First Chief Directorate in 1978, where he was assigned to the administrative section responsible for managing operational budgets and expense accounts for field officers operating abroad. The work was bureaucratic, unglamorous, the kind of assignment that career officers viewed as a dead end, but Volkov had been good at it, methodical and detail-oriented, the kind of person who noticed when numbers did not add up and who understood that financial records could reveal operational patterns that field reports might obscure. In July of 1984, while reviewing quarterly expense reports submitted by the Western European section, Volkov had noticed that several accounts showed expenditures that did not match the operational activities documented in the corresponding field reports. The discrepancies were small, amounts ranging from several hundred to a few thousand rubles, the kind of variances that could be explained by legitimate operational expenses that had not been properly documented or by minor accounting errors. But when Volkov began systematically reviewing expense reports from other sections, he found similar discrepancies across multiple departments, and the cumulative total of unexplained expenditures was significant enough to suggest that something more serious than accounting errors was occurring. Volkov spent the next 6 weeks conducting a quiet investigation, reviewing financial records going back 3 years, cross-referencing expense reports with operational files, and building a detailed spreadsheet that tracked unexplained expenditures across different departments and time periods. What he found troubled him deeply. The discrepancies were not random. They followed patterns that suggested systematic diversion of operational funds, and the amounts involved totaled hundreds of thousands of rubles, possibly more if the pattern extended beyond the records he had access to review. The money was being siphoned through false expense claims, inflated operational budgets, and fabricated payments to non-existent agents and informants. It was corruption on a scale that Volkov had never encountered in his 16 years with the KGB, and it appeared to involve officers at multiple levels of the organization, from field officers submitting false expense reports to section chiefs, approving budgets they knew contained fraudulent claims to senior administrators who were either complicit in the scheme or willfully blind to what was happening under their supervision. Volkov understood that what he had discovered was dangerous information, the kind of information that could destroy careers and possibly cost him his own life if he reported it to the wrong person, or if the people involved in the corruption learned that he was investigating them. The KGB had a reputation for loyalty to its own, for protecting officers who followed orders and maintaining a code of silence about internal problems that might embarrass the organization or undermine its effectiveness. But Volkov was also a man who believed in the mission of the KGB, who had spent his career serving the Soviet state and who could not reconcile what he had found with his understanding of what the organization was supposed to represent. He spent several days considering his options, weighing the risks of reporting what he had found against the risks of remaining silent, and eventually he decided that he had no choice but to bring the information to the attention of someone in the leadership who might be willing to act on it. On September 4, 1984, Volkov requested a meeting with General Viktor Chebrikov, the chairman of the KGB. Chebrikov had been appointed to the position in December of 1982, replacing Vitaly Fedorchuk, who had served for only 6 months after the death of Yuri Andropov. Chebrikov was 61 years old, a career party official who had spent most of his working life in the Communist Party apparatus in Ukraine before being brought into the KGB by Andropov in 1967. He had a reputation as a hardliner, a man who believed in discipline and order, who had supported Andropov's anti-corruption campaigns in the early 1980s, and who had maintained close ties to the party leadership even as the political situation in Moscow became increasingly unstable under the ailing Chernenko. Volkov did not know whether Chebrikov would be receptive to the information he was bringing, or whether reporting the corruption would simply result in his own arrest or reassignment to a remote posting where he could be silenced. But he believed that Chebrikov represented the best chance of initiating a serious investigation without triggering immediate retaliation from the officers involved in the scheme. The meeting took place on September 10th in Chebrikov's office at Lubyanka, the KGB headquarters in central Moscow. Volkov had prepared a detailed briefing package containing copies of the financial records he had reviewed, his analysis of the patterns of fraudulent expenditures, and a list of the departments and officers whose accounts showed the most significant discrepancies. He had also prepared a separate memorandum summarizing his findings and recommending that the chairman order a comprehensive audit of operational budgets across all directorates to determine the full extent of the corruption. Chebrikov listened to the briefing without interrupting, his expression impassive, and when Volkov finished, Chebrikov asked a series of detailed questions about the methodology Volkov had used to identify the discrepancies, the reliability of the financial records, and whether Volkov had discussed his findings with anyone else. Volkov answered carefully, emphasizing that he had conducted the investigation alone and that he had not shared the information with any other officers or administrators. Chebrikov thanked Volkov for bringing the matter to his attention and told him to return to his regular duties and to speak to no one about the investigation. He said that he would review the materials Volkov had provided and would decide on an appropriate course of action. Volkov left the meeting with the distinct impression that Chebrikov had been troubled by what he had heard, but was uncertain about how to proceed, and over the next several weeks Volkov heard nothing from the chairman's office and saw no indication that any investigation had been initiated. He continued his regular work, reviewing expense reports and managing operational budgets, but he also continued monitoring the financial records for new evidence of fraud, and what he found suggested that the corruption was not only continuing but was accelerating, as if the officers involved believed they could operate with impunity. What Volkov did not know was that Chebrikov had taken the matter seriously and had quietly initiated an investigation using a small team of trusted officers from the Internal Security Directorate. The investigation had confirmed Volkov's findings and had uncovered additional evidence suggesting that the corruption extended far beyond the First Chief Directorate and involved officers in multiple departments, including counterintelligence, military intelligence liaison, and even the security services responsible for protecting party leadership. The amounts involved were staggering, potentially running into millions of rubles when all the fraudulent accounts were tallied, and the investigation had identified dozens of officers who appeared to be participating in the scheme at various levels of the organization. But what troubled Chebrikov most was not the scale of the corruption, but what it revealed about the institutional culture of the KGB itself. The organization that was supposed to be the sword and shield of the Soviet state, the institution charged with protecting the party and ensuring the security of the nation, had become riddled with officers who were more interested in enriching themselves than in serving the state, and the corruption had been allowed to flourish because senior leadership had either failed to notice or had chosen to ignore it. Chebrikov faced a profound dilemma. If he ordered mass arrests and prosecutions of the officers involved in the corruption, he would expose the KGB to public scrutiny and political criticism at a time when the Soviet Union was already experiencing economic crisis and political instability. The revelation that the KGB itself was corrupt would undermine the legitimacy of the entire Soviet system and would provide ammunition to reformers within the party who were calling for greater transparency and accountability. But if he did nothing, if he allowed the corruption to continue, he would be complicit in the decay of the institution he had been appointed to lead, and the rot would continue to spread until it destroyed the KGB's operational effectiveness entirely. He spent weeks consulting with trusted advisors, reviewing the evidence compiled by the internal investigation, and considering the political implications of different courses of action. In late October of 1984, Chebrikov made his decision. He would not order mass arrests or public prosecutions. Instead, he would quietly reassign the most egregious offenders to remote postings where they could do no further damage. He would implement new financial controls and audit procedures to prevent future fraud, and he would issue a confidential directive to all department heads warning that future instances of corruption would be dealt with severely. It was a compromise solution, one that would allow him to address the problem without triggering a political crisis. But it was also a solution that left many guilty officers unpunished and did nothing to restore the institutional integrity that had been lost. The directive was issued in early November, and its effects rippled through the organization over the following weeks as officers who had been involved in the corruption schemes realized that their activities had been discovered and that they were now vulnerable to internal discipline or prosecution. Some of them panicked, making operational mistakes or behaving erratically as they tried to cover their tracks. Others simply withdrew from active operations, fearing that any misstep would draw additional scrutiny. The result was the pattern of behavioral anomalies that Thomas Brennan had identified in the field reports from CIA stations across Europe and North America. But the consequences of what Chebrikov had discovered went far beyond the immediate operational disruptions. The revelation of widespread corruption within the KGB had fundamentally undermined his confidence in the organization and in the Soviet system itself. Chebrikov had spent his entire career believing in the mission of the party and the righteousness of the Soviet cause, but what he had found suggested that the system was rotting from within, that the ideological commitment that was supposed to motivate Soviet officials had given way to cynicism and greed, and that the institutions charged with defending the state were themselves compromised beyond repair. He began to question whether the Soviet Union could survive in its current form, whether the economic and political crisis that was already evident in the early 1980s could be addressed through reform, or whether the entire system would need to be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. These doubts, which Chebrikov shared only with a small circle of trusted associates, would have profound consequences in the years that followed. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March of 1985 and began implementing his policies of glasnost and perestroika, Chebrikov did not resist. He understood that the system was unsustainable, that the corruption and dysfunction he had witnessed inside the KGB were symptoms of larger problems that affected every institution in Soviet society, and that without fundamental reform the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. He supported Gorbachev's reforms even when they threatened the power and authority of the KGB itself, because he believed that preserving the institution in its current form was less important than preventing the complete disintegration of the Soviet state. But the reforms came too late and moved too slowly to save the system. The economic crisis deepened, nationalist movements gained strength in the republics, and the political authority of the Communist Party eroded as revelations of corruption and incompetence undermined its legitimacy. The KGB, weakened by internal divisions and demoralized by the knowledge of its own corruption, proved unable to prevent the collapse when it came. In August of 1991, a group of hardline KGB officers and party officials attempted a coup to restore the old order, but the coup failed because the conspirators lacked the institutional support and popular legitimacy necessary to impose their will on a society that had lost faith in the system they represented. By December of 1991, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, and the KGB had been dissolved and replaced by successor agencies that inherited its buildings and personnel, but not its ideological mission or institutional authority. Thomas Brennan continued tracking Soviet intelligence operations throughout the second half of the 1980s, documenting the gradual decline of KGB effectiveness as the organization struggled with internal problems and external pressures. He briefed senior CIA leadership on the patterns he had identified, but his analysis was largely ignored by policymakers who were focused on more immediate concerns about Soviet military capabilities and arms control negotiations. It was not until after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when former KGB officers began speaking publicly about the corruption and dysfunction that had plagued the organization during its final years, that Brennan's early warnings were vindicated. By then he had retired from the agency, and the intelligence assessments he had compiled in 1984 had been declassified and archived, available to historians and researchers trying to understand how the Cold War had ended, not with the dramatic confrontation many had predicted, but with the quiet disintegration of a system that had rotted from within. Konstantin Volkov remained in his position at the first Chief Directorate until 1989, when he retired with the rank of colonel. He never spoke publicly about what he had discovered or about his meeting with Chebrikov, and he spent his remaining years living quietly in Moscow on a modest KGB pension. He died in 2006 at the age of 61, and his role in exposing the corruption that had contributed to the collapse of the Soviet intelligence apparatus remained unknown until a Russian journalist researching KGB history came across references to his investigation in declassified internal documents years after his death. The journalist published a brief article about Volkov's findings in a Moscow newspaper, but the story received little attention, and Volkov's name never became widely known outside academic circles that study the final years of the Soviet Union. Viktor Chebrikov served as chairman of the KGB until September of 1988, when he was removed from the position as part of Gorbachev's efforts to reduce the political influence of the security services. He was appointed to a ceremonial position in the Communist Party Secretariat, where he had no real authority, and he retired from public life in 1990 when it became clear that the Soviet system was collapsing. He died in 1999 at the age of 76, and in the years before his death he gave several interviews to Russian journalists in which he discussed the challenges he had faced as KGB chairman during the final years of the Soviet Union. In those interviews he acknowledged that the KGB had been compromised by corruption, and that the organization had failed to provide accurate intelligence to Soviet leadership about the severity of the economic and political crisis facing the country. He expressed regret that he had not acted more aggressively to root out the corruption when he first discovered it, and he suggested that the failure of the KGB to maintain its institutional integrity had contributed to the collapse of the Soviet state. The field reports that Thomas Brennan had reviewed in November of 1984 remained classified until 2005, when they were declassified as part of a broader release of CIA documents related to Cold War intelligence operations. The reports were made available to researchers through the National Archives, and they provided detailed documentation of the behavioral anomalies that Brennan had identified among Soviet intelligence officers during the final years of the Cold War. Historians who have studied these documents have noted that they represent one of the earliest indications that the Soviet intelligence apparatus was experiencing internal problems, and they have used the reports to support analyses suggesting that the collapse of the Soviet Union was driven not primarily by external pressure from the United States, but by internal decay and institutional failure within the Soviet system itself. The story of what happened inside the KGB in the mid-1980s, the discovery of widespread corruption, the failed attempt to address it through internal reform, and the gradual disintegration of the organization's operational effectiveness has become part of the larger narrative about how the Cold War ended. It was not dramatic confrontation or military victory that brought down the Soviet Union, but the quiet accumulation of internal contradictions that eventually became unsustainable. The system that had been built on ideology and coercion proved unable to adapt to economic reality or political change, and the institutions that were supposed to defend it were themselves too compromised to prevent its collapse. The KGB, which had been feared throughout the Cold War as one of the most effective intelligence services in the world, turned out to be as vulnerable to corruption and dysfunction as any other Soviet institution, and its failure represented not just an organizational crisis, but a symptom of the larger failure of the Soviet system itself. What Thomas Brennan had identified in those field reports in November of 1984 was the beginning of the end, the first visible signs that something fundamental had broken inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus, and that the organization that had been the sword and shield of the Soviet state was losing its effectiveness and its purpose. He had been right to be troubled by the anomalies he had found, right to suspect that they represented something more significant than routine operational problems, but he could not have known at the time just how significant those anomalies would prove to be, or how completely they would confirm his analysis that the Soviet system was experiencing a crisis from which it would not recover. The reports he compiled and the briefings he delivered were filed away and largely forgotten by policymakers who were focused on other priorities, but they stand now as evidence that someone inside the CIA had recognized what was happening inside the KGB even before the Soviet leadership fully understood the implications of what they were facing. The corruption that Konstantin Volkov had discovered was not unique to the KGB. It was endemic throughout Soviet institutions, from the Communist Party to the military to the economic ministries that were supposed to manage the planned economy. Officers and officials at every level of the system had learned that the ideological commitments that were supposed to motivate their work were empty rhetoric, that the promises of socialism had failed to deliver prosperity or justice, and that the only rational response was to enrich themselves while they could and to protect their own interests rather than serving the collective good. This cynicism and self-dealing had been growing for years, but it accelerated in the early 1980s as the economic crisis deepened and it became clear to those inside the system that the Soviet Union was failing and that reform was unlikely to save it. The result was a collapse of institutional integrity that affected every organization within the Soviet state, and the KGB, which was supposed to be the most disciplined and ideologically committed institution, proved to be just as vulnerable to this decay as any other part of the system. The meetings between Volkov and Chebrikov, the internal investigation that followed, and the decision to handle the corruption quietly rather than through public prosecutions, all took place in secret and were not known to Western intelligence services at the time. The CIA knew that something was wrong inside the KGB based on the behavioral anomalies documented in field reports, but they did not know the cause or the extent of the internal crisis. It was not until years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when former KGB officers began writing memoirs and when Russian journalists gained access to previously classified archives, that the full story of the corruption and the failed attempt to address it became known. Those revelations confirmed what analysts like Thomas Brennan had suspected, that the Soviet intelligence apparatus had been experiencing a profound internal crisis during the final years of the Cold War, and that this crisis had contributed significantly to the collapse of the Soviet system. The KGB had been built on a foundation of fear and loyalty, sustained by the belief that officers who served the organization were part of an elite vanguard defending the Soviet state against internal and external enemies. But by the mid-1980s, that foundation had crumbled, replaced by cynicism and corruption that undermined everything the organization was supposed to represent. Officers who had once believed in the mission of the KGB found themselves working alongside colleagues who viewed their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than service to the state, and the institutional culture that had once valued discipline and loyalty gave way to a culture of self-preservation and moral compromise. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was the result of years of economic decline, political stagnation, and ideological exhaustion, and by the time leaders like Chebrikov recognized the problem, it was too late to fix it through internal reforms alone. The field reports that documented Soviet intelligence officers behaving erratically in the fall of 1984 were snapshots of a system in crisis, evidence that the institutional discipline that had once made the KGB effective was breaking down. The officers who missed meetings, who drank too much at diplomatic receptions, who withdrew from operational activity, were not acting on orders from Moscow Center. They were reacting to the knowledge that their organization was compromised, that their careers were at risk, and that the system they had served was collapsing around them. Some of them were directly involved in the corruption schemes that Volkov had exposed. Others had simply lost confidence in the KGB's mission or in the leadership's ability to address the problems the organization faced. But all of them were symptoms of the same underlying crisis, the realization that the Soviet system was failing and that the institutions charged with defending it were themselves part of the failure. Thomas Brennan understood this intuitively when he reviewed those field reports in November of 1984, even though he could not have articulated exactly what was happening inside the KGB or predicted how completely the organization would collapse over the following years. He recognized that the pattern he was seeing was not tactical or operational, but systemic, that it reflected something fundamentally wrong with the Soviet intelligence apparatus, and that understanding this pattern was essential to understanding the larger trajectory of the Cold War. His analysis was ahead of its time, prescient in ways that would only become apparent years later when historians looked back at the final years of the Soviet Union and tried to understand how and why the system had collapsed. The reports he compiled and the briefings he delivered stand now as evidence that someone inside the American intelligence community had recognized what was happening before it became obvious to everyone else, and that this recognition might have provided opportunities for the United States to exploit Soviet weaknesses if policymakers had been willing to listen and act on the intelligence they were receiving. But those opportunities were largely missed because the focus of American policy in the mid-1980s was on arms control negotiations and managing the military competition with the Soviet Union rather than on understanding the internal dynamics of Soviet institutions or recognizing the signs of systemic collapse. The intelligence about KGB corruption and operational dysfunction was filed away and forgotten, and by the time it became relevant again, the Cold War was over and the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. The story of what happened inside the KGB during those years remained largely unknown until researchers began piecing it together from declassified documents and interviews with former officers years after the events had occurred. It is a story about institutional failure, about the corrosive effects of corruption on organizations, built on ideology, and about how systems that appear strong and permanent can collapse suddenly when the internal contradictions they have been suppressing finally become unsustainable. Konstantin Volkov's discovery of the corruption and his decision to report it to Viktor Chebrikov set in motion a chain of events that neither man could have predicted or controlled. The investigation that followed exposed the extent of the problem, but also revealed that addressing it through conventional means was impossible because the corruption was too widespread and too deeply embedded in the institutional culture of the KGB. Chebrikov's decision to handle the problem quietly, rather than through public prosecutions, was a pragmatic response to an impossible situation. But it also meant that the underlying problems were never addressed and that the institutional rot continued to spread until it destroyed the organization's effectiveness entirely. The officers who were reassigned or disciplined learned that corruption could be practiced with relative impunity as long as it was not too blatant, and the officers who were not caught learned that the system was too weak to enforce its own rules. The behavioral anomalies that Thomas Brennan documented in the field reports were the visible symptoms of this internal collapse, evidence that the KGB was losing its operational discipline and its institutional coherence. The officers who behaved erratically or withdrew from active operations were not defecting or planning to defect. They were simply reacting to the knowledge that their organization was compromised and that their careers and possibly their lives were at risk if the corruption scandal became public. Some of them were trying to distance themselves from the schemes they had participated in. Others were paralyzed by uncertainty about what would happen next. But all of them were evidence that the Soviet intelligence apparatus was experiencing a crisis that went far beyond routine operational problems and that suggested fundamental weaknesses in the Soviet system itself. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the culmination of processes that had been building for years, and the corruption crisis inside the KGB was one of many factors that contributed to that collapse. Economic stagnation, political gridlock, nationalist movements in the republics, the costs of the war in Afghanistan, the failure of reforms to address systemic problems, all of these played roles in undermining the Soviet system and making its eventual collapse inevitable. But the corruption inside the KGB was particularly significant because it demonstrated that even the institutions charged with defending the state had lost faith in the mission they were supposed to serve and had become more interested in preserving their own power and privileges than in protecting the collective good. When the sword and shield of the Soviet state proved to be as corrupt and dysfunctional as every other Soviet institution, it became clear that the system could not be reformed or saved, and that collapse was only a matter of time. The story of what Thomas Brennan found in those field reports, what Konstantin Volkov discovered in the financial records, and what Viktor Chebrikov tried unsuccessfully to fix through internal reforms is ultimately a story about the end of the Cold War and the collapse of one of the 20th century's great ideological experiments. It is a story about how systems built on coercion and fear eventually destroy themselves when the people who are supposed to enforce discipline and loyalty lose faith in the mission they are serving. It is a story about how corruption spreads through institutions when accountability breaks down, and when officers and officials learn that personal enrichment is more important than collective purpose. And it is a story about how intelligence services can fail, not because they lack resources or tradecraft, but because they lose sight of the values and commitments that are supposed to motivate their work and give meaning to their sacrifices. The field reports that documented Soviet intelligence officers behaving erratically in the fall of 1984 sit now in the National Archives, declassified and available to researchers who want to understand how the Cold War ended. They are footnotes in the larger story of Soviet collapse, evidence that someone inside the American intelligence community recognized early that something was wrong inside the KGB and that this recognition might have provided opportunities if policymakers had been willing to act on it. But they are also reminders that intelligence work is about more than collecting secrets and running operations. It is about understanding the systems and institutions that shape international politics, about recognizing patterns that suggest larger trends, and about having the courage to report uncomfortable truths even when those truths challenge prevailing assumptions or contradict official policy. Thomas Brennan spent his career doing exactly that kind of work, analyzing patterns in intelligence reporting, identifying anomalies that suggested larger problems, and trying to help policymakers understand the dynamics of the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. His analysis of the behavioral anomalies among Soviet intelligence officers in November of 1984 was one example of this work, and while his conclusions were largely ignored at the time, they have been vindicated by subsequent events and by the research that historians and journalists have conducted using declassified documents and interviews with former KGB officers. He recognized that the Soviet system was experiencing a profound internal crisis years before that crisis became visible to everyone else, and his recognition was based not on secret intelligence from sources inside the Kremlin, but on careful analysis of routine field reports that most analysts would have dismissed as insignificant operational noise. Konstantin Volkov never received recognition for the role he played in exposing the corruption that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet intelligence apparatus. He remained an anonymous mid-level officer whose investigation was buried in classified files and whose findings were acted upon only in ways that protected the institution rather than addressing the underlying problems he had identified. He spent his final years watching the Soviet Union collapse and the KGB dissolve, knowing that the corruption he had discovered had been a symptom of larger failures but unable to speak publicly about what he had seen or what he had tried to do about it. His story emerged only after his death, when researchers gained access to declassified documents, and even then it remained largely unknown outside specialist circles that study the history of Soviet intelligence services. Viktor Chebrikov lived long enough to see the system he had served his entire life collapse completely, and in his final interviews he acknowledged that the KGB had failed in its fundamental mission, not because of external pressure from the United States, but because of internal decay and institutional corruption that had undermined its effectiveness and legitimacy. He expressed regret that he had not acted more decisively when the corruption was first brought to his attention, but he also recognized that by the time he became aware of the problem, it was probably already too late to save the organization or the system it was supposed to defend. His tenure as KGB chairman coincided with the final years of the Soviet Union, and his attempts to manage the corruption crisis while maintaining operational effectiveness represented a desperate effort to hold together an institution that was collapsing under the weight of contradictions it could no longer suppress or ignore. The Cold War ended not with the dramatic confrontation that many had anticipated, but with the quiet disintegration of a system that had rotted from within. The corruption that Volkov discovered inside the KGB was not the cause of the Soviet collapse, but it was emblematic of the larger failures that made collapse inevitable. When the institutions charged with defending the Soviet state proved to be as compromised and dysfunctional as the system they were supposed to protect, when officers and officials at every level of the hierarchy learned that personal enrichment mattered more than ideological commitment, and when the leadership proved incapable of addressing these problems through reform or discipline, the end became only a matter of time. The Soviet Union did not fall because the United States won the Cold War. It fell because it destroyed itself through decades of economic mismanagement, political repression, and institutional corruption that eventually overwhelmed any remaining capacity for reform or adaptation. The field reports that Thomas Brennan reviewed in November of 1984 captured this process in its early stages, documenting the behavioral symptoms of an organization in crisis and providing evidence that the Soviet intelligence apparatus was losing its operational discipline and institutional coherence. Those reports were ignored by policymakers who were focused on other priorities, but they stand now as evidence that the signs of Soviet collapse were visible years before the final crisis, if anyone had been willing to look carefully and think critically about what the intelligence was revealing. The story of what happened inside the KGB during those years, the corruption that Volkov exposed, the investigation that Chebrikov ordered, and the failed attempt to address the problems through internal reform, has become part of the larger narrative about how and why the Cold War ended the way it did. It is a story without heroes or villains, only individuals trying to navigate impossible situations within a system that was failing around them. Volkov tried to do his duty by reporting the corruption he discovered, but his efforts resulted only in limited internal reforms that failed to address the underlying problems. Chebrikov tried to manage the crisis without destroying the institution he led, but his cautious approach allowed the corruption to continue and the rot to spread. Brennan tried to alert his superiors to the signs of Soviet institutional failure, but his analysis was filed away and forgotten by people who did not want to hear that the enemy they had been fighting for decades was collapsing from internal weaknesses rather than external pressure. And the Soviet intelligence officers whose erratic behavior was documented in those field reports were simply trying to survive in an organization that had lost its purpose and its legitimacy, knowing that the system they had served was coming apart but unable to do anything to prevent or escape the consequences. The declassified documents that tell this story sit in archives now, available to anyone who wants to understand how the Cold War ended and what factors contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. They are technical intelligence reports, financial records, meeting transcripts, and internal memoranda that document in bureaucratic language the human drama of institutional failure and systemic collapse. They show how corruption spreads through organizations when accountability breaks down, how institutional culture deteriorates when officers lose faith in their mission, and how systems that appear strong and permanent can collapse suddenly when the contradictions they have been suppressing finally become unsustainable. They are documents that capture a moment in history when the Cold War was ending not through military confrontation or diplomatic breakthrough, but through the quiet disintegration of one side's capacity to continue the competition. Thomas Brennan retired from the CIA in 1993 after 25 years of service. He spent his retirement years writing occasional articles for academic journals about Cold War intelligence operations and consulting with historians researching the final years of the Soviet Union. He never spoke publicly about the classified work he had done, but he watched with satisfaction as declassified documents confirmed the analysis he had developed in the mid-1980s about Soviet institutional failure and KGB operational decline. He died in 2011 at the age of 69, and his obituary in the Washington Post made brief mention of his career at the CIA, but did not detail the intelligence assessments he had compiled or the warnings he had delivered that went largely unheeded by policymakers focused on other priorities. The corruption crisis inside the KGB that began with Volkov's investigation in the summer of 1984 and that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet intelligence apparatus over the following years represents one chapter in the larger story of how the Cold War ended. It is a chapter that has received less attention than the arms control negotiations, the summit meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev, and the dramatic events of 1989 and 1991 when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union dissolved. But it is an important chapter because it shows that the end of the Cold War was determined not primarily by what American policymakers did, but by internal failures within the Soviet system that made its collapse inevitable regardless of external pressure or diplomatic efforts. The story of what Thomas Brennan found in those field reports What Konstantin Volkov discovered in the financial records and what Viktor Chebrikov tried unsuccessfully to address through internal reforms is ultimately a story about the limits of institutional power and the consequences of systemic corruption. It is a story that reminds us that organizations built on ideology and coercion are vulnerable to decay when the people who staff them lose faith in the mission they are supposed to serve. It is a story that demonstrates how intelligence services can fail, not because they lack resources or expertise, but because they become compromised by the same corruption and dysfunction that afflicts the societies they are meant to protect. And it is a story that shows how the end of great historical conflicts can come not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet accumulation of failures and contradictions that eventually make continuation impossible. The field reports sit in the archives, the financial records remain classified in Moscow, and the people who played roles in this story are mostly dead or silent about what they experienced during those final years of the Cold War. But the documents that survived and the testimony that has been preserved tell a story that matters because it helps us understand how systems collapse, how institutions fail, and how ideological certainties give way to cynicism and self-interest when the promises they are built on prove to be empty. It is a story about the end of the Soviet Union, but it is also a story about the fragility of all human institutions and the consequences of allowing corruption and dysfunction to go unaddressed until they destroy the organizations and systems they infect.